I had a great shot, blue skies, totally clear. I tilted up just as the GoPro on the drone tilted down. And I saw the red light blinking, which immediately told me it's recording and there's a chip in that camera. But what I didn't know is the drone operator, some worthless little pervert within a mile of me looking at a monitor, is he recording it there as well? And this all goes through the reptilian part of your brain very, very quickly, but all you can really think of is, if I pull that trigger and revel in the satisfying tinkle of cheap plastic falling down onto the deck, is all of it going to pop up on the internet, moments later?
Hi, I'm Nick Gillespie with Reason TV, and we are sitting down with Mike Rowe of the Mike Rowe Works Foundation, and of recently of Somebody's Got to Do It, and of Dirty Jobs. Mike Rowe, thanks for talking to Reason TV.
Last time I saw you, you were wearing that same jacket, and I was wearing this same hat.
Well, there you go. What comes around goes around. Now, the two headlines that you are most famous for most recently are Naked Mike Rowe and Mike Rowe Dead. Why were you naked, and how did that lead to you being dead?
Well, it was a big week.
Yeah.
I was in the midst of what I thought was some bizarre gardening dream, and in the dream, a bumblebee was in my ear. And when I awakened, I realized A, it wasn't a dream, and B, it wasn't a bee. But there was a buzzing sound, and it was coming from the other side of my bedroom window, and I leapt from the bed in what I described as my favorite pair of imaginary pajamas. And I pulled the drapes aside, and there was a camera hovering, not in midair, but from the belly of a drone. And the drone was making this horrible buzzing sound, and I was standing there in my horrible nakedness, not fully awake, but sentient enough to know that something had to be done. So I retreated to the bed, and pulled the Mossberg 500 from underneath.
And by the way, do you get is that a product placement?
It's not. I just like the way I feel when I say Mossberg 500. It's a great shotgun.
Oh.
I keep it locked and loaded, and the familiar chunk is very gratifying.
Now this is in San Francisco, so is that legal to have a locked and loaded shotgun?
It's hard to know, but probably not.
So you're naked with a shotgun,
right?
And the drone.
So technically not naked,
okay.
Clothed in the security that can only come from the Mossberg 500.
And I'm assuming, like most gun owners, you're fully erect as well, right? Because the gun is an extension.
Partially.
Okay.
And to be fair, it's very difficult to tell, in my case, the difference between me, fully erect, and a Mossberg 500. In whatever state I happened to be in, I ran down the stairs with the gun, out onto the deck, and I looked up to where I had last seen the drone, and the thing had actually hovered in a little closer to the window. So I had a great shot, blue skies, totally clear. I tilted up just as the GoPro on the drone tilted down. And I saw the red light blinking, which immediately told me it's recording and there's a chip in that camera. But what I didn't know is the drone operator, some worthless little pervert within a mile of me looking at a monitor, is he recording it there as well? Right. And this all goes through the reptilian part of your brain very, very quickly, but all you can really think of is, if I pull that trigger and revel in the satisfying tinkle of cheap plastic falling down onto the deck, is all of it going to pop up on the internet, moments later? So I froze, and the drone flew away, and I got one shot of it from my iPhone, and I posted that and
on your
shared
Facebook page.
I did.
So the footage has not surfaced as of yet?
Not to my knowledge, and I'm fairly sure I'll know about it.
We will be getting our
offer
to you to own the footage, probably within 30 to 40 minutes. So
thank you.
Expect that.
I'll direct you to TMZ, where I'm sure a healthy bidding war will unfold.
So what does that feel like? Because we're libertarians and we kind of like transparency, but then this is also obviously an invasion of privacy. Where do you, and that's a good job, right? So somebody's working that thing. That's a job that they have. So
sure. Look, I think the reason that goofy little post was shared millions of times was because, on the one hand, it's a naked guy with a shotgun in San Francisco, so there's something there. But we're also talking about this weird collision of privacy and technology and Second Amendment and all these things that happen to be in the headlines, it seems, on a fairly regular basis.
You're a big Second Amendment guy, or you like guns?
I'm a fan of the Second Amendment.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of the Bill of Rights. I've grown up with guns. I've always had guns. I'm not an NRA guy, not because I have anything against them, just because I'm not much of a joiner.
What is it, something that as a gun owner or a lifelong gun user, you can tell somebody like me or other people who are uncomfortable about guns that would make us feel more comfortable about them?
I don't have a smart answer, but I will say that it's interesting how you're either in the NRA or you're not. And I think that's a false division. I think the country's full of a lot of false divisions right now. And I think there are a lot of people, actually, like me, who aren't a member of the NRA, but do own a gun,
right,
who happen to not be psycho killers and criminals. And those people, I think it's easy to ignore them.
Well, hopefully, right? I mean, the psycho killers get all the attention, right?
Or the nude guy.
Yeah.
You know, they used to have a TV show with a shotgun on a deck.
So that led to the naked Mike Rowe headlines, and then there was, after that, partly because you were holding a gun, there were this rash of Mike Rowe dead headlines, and you talk a little bit about that on your Facebook page.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still coming up probably. What is it like to have your death announced? And not to be a South American dictator where, you know, oh my God, I better not get up this morning.
This will sound odd, but it's weirdly flattering, you know, because what comes back over the net is a massive amount of concern and curiosity from friends and family. And I don't wish to manipulate either group, but in Facebook land, you know, you got 4 million friends. So people are just rushing to find out, you know, is there any truth to this? And then you get to like bathe in their relief, right?
Yeah.
Because no, I'm alive. And most of all, you get to quote Twain,
right,
if in fact he ever said it.
Right.
But purportedly,
which is that the rumors of, or the
reports of my
Mike
death have been grossly exaggerated.
Did you lose any friends over this because they finally said what they thought about you all along?
You mean,
you know, that posted to your Facebook page, I am glad he's dead.
He's dead,
you know,
about time.
Yeah.
No, but the cruelest comments were, I thought he was gone years ago.
Which I guess was about F. Scott Fitzgerald. That's what was said about. I thought he died years ago.
That stung.
Well, speaking of which, your show on CNN, Somebody's Got to Do It, which was similar to Dirty Jobs, where you went and looked at hobbies and other tasks that people did, sometimes in extreme ways. You worked on an aquatic show in Vegas. You hung out with the goat cheese queen of Humboldt County, California. You did another water ballet because you're a closet water ballet fan. That is now gone off the air. That has ended at CNN.
It has.
Why did it end?
The good news is it hasn't ended. It ended on CNN. We shot season 4. It's about to reemerge somewhere else. What happened was the election and riots and terrorism and natural disasters and all the trouble in the world.
Yeah.
And, you know, I appreciate CNN giving me an hour of prime time to tell lighthearted stories about people who I think are worth knowing.
Right.
But it's one thing to compete with everything else on TV. It's another thing to compete with all the trouble in the world. Because, you know, you don't want to be, something bad happens somewhere and people go to CNN. You don't want to see a smart aleck investigating the lowride culture or making cheese in Humboldt County, right, with his tongue in his cheek. On the other hand, if you're me and you tell 4 million people, hey, you know, Tuesday nights, 9 o'clock, and I'm not on because, you know, Cuba just opened up.
Right.
Okay, so it was an experiment, and to some degree, it's working for some shows. But Bourdain, who's doing a fabulous show, is not, you know, he's not taking a lighthearted look at anonymous people you should know. He's doing video essays and reportage in foreign countries. And actually, turn the sound down, it looks a lot like a CNN report. So it fits, you know. I just stuck out.
Who are the people that we should know? You know, obviously they do all sorts of different things. I mean, this is, you're famous for your sheep castration stories, of course.
People should know that guy.
Yeah, people should know that. You know, if you know anything, coming out of college, you should know how to use your mouth to castrate sheep, right? But, you know, I mean, you talk to a lot of people, guys who work in septic tanks, guys who work in sewers, guys who work, you know, hanging from wires on bridges.
Yeah.
What do the people that we should know, that you think we Americans should know, have in common?
Well, I think the most honest thing I ever wrote was on a lunch bag before the first episode of Dirty Jobs. The president of Discovery at the time said, the show needs a mission statement. And I was like, oh, God, a mission statement? Really? I mean, you just put a glass eye to sleep with these things, you know, they're just so earnest and dreadful. But she was right. And what I wrote was, my name is Mike Rowe, this is my job, I explore the country looking for people who aren't afraid to get dirty, hard-working men and women who do the kinds of jobs that make civilized life possible for the rest of us. Dirty Jobs was about me finding those people because I believe you should know them. Mm-hmm. Somebody's Got to Do It was slightly different. That was a show about people who I think you should know because they wake up agitated. Mm-hmm. They wake up convinced that there's a better mousetrap, or they're Don Quixote, they're tilting at windmills, or they're Sisyphus pushing some rock up a hill, and they're doing a thing because they're compelled to do it. And those people, I think, are interesting for a slightly different reason.
And these are healthy obsessions, right?
That's
I mean,
right.
this is it's not the psycho killer, or
no.
Maybe that's season 15 as serial killers.
We're saving that for sweeps.
Okay.
Serial killers,
yeah,
you should have over for dinner.
Yes.
Yeah.
What has happened? Like, have we become so disconnected? Whether it's from people who have, you know, a kind of compulsion or a healthy obsession of, I want to do this. This is my passion project, or the people who do the work, the hidden work that makes civilization fun and nice and clean and you know, just wonderful. Have we lost touch with that in our society? And if we have, in these two dimensions, what's the cause of that?
I think the irony of the current level of disconnectedness is directly a result of the current level of connectedness. I think for the first time in history, you and I are walking around with a network in our pockets. You know, it's not a phone or a camera; it's a network. We can broadcast. We're more connected today than we ever have been in what feels to me like a superficial way. But at the same time, if there was some sort of graph that would indicate this, I think we would see a growing disconnect between the average person and an understanding of where our food comes from, where our energy comes from.
And I know with food, you've talked about this, it's something like 1% or 1.5% of Americans are involved in the producing of food. So most of us, you know, it just shows up in the supermarkets, it shows up on our plates.
It's magic.
Yeah.
It's magic. Look, the modern agriculture is nothing short of miraculous, but the work that's still done in areas like artificial insemination and basic animal husbandry is completely alien to most people. Mm-hmm. So the only way you feed 300 million people 3 times a day is through a marvel of effectiveness and efficiency. And so the modern farmer is heroic, and the modern farmer has an image problem because the average person addicted to chewing and swallowing still sees them as Buck Owens or Roy Clark in Hee Haw playing a banjo and wearing overalls and clearing the South 40. So the same thing that has made farming difficult, well, the military faces it. You know, 1.5% of people serve in the armed forces. The number of tradesmen working right now is actually very, very small, relevant to the entire population. Mm-hmm. And so we're disconnected, in my opinion, from things like food, energy, the prevailing definition of a good job. Mm-hmm. The most fundamental things are infrastructure. Even as we've become uber connected,
literally
to Uber.
Yeah,
right? Of course. I mean, it's just it's fascinating to me, and clearly that's the price, the unintended price we're paying of this amazing level of connectedness is this fundamental decoupling from what's really important.
Do you think the work ethic suffers when, because we're taking for granted all of the marvels of the world, that, you know, we no longer live in a world where when you flip a switch, the lights don't come on or it shorts out and shocks you?
The way I would say it is we no longer live in a world where when you flick the switch and the lights do come on, your initial feeling isn't one of wonder. There is no initial feeling. You know, the only feeling that comes is when you flick the switch and the lights don't come on. And then, isn't it amazing how quickly we're outraged? You know, when we flush the toilet and the crap doesn't go away. What?
Yeah.
What? You know, the miracle of modern plumbing, the miracle of affordable electricity, all these things now, we're just not sufficiently gobsmacked. And when we lose our sense of wonder and our basic appreciation, that sets the groundwork for the eventual disconnect that leads to vocational education vanishing from high school, a widening skills gap contemporaneous with spiking unemployment, and all of these seemingly dichotomous things that leave people scratching their heads. My foundation takes the position that these things aren't problems. These are symptoms of a larger wrestling and confusion with what a good job is.
So talk about the work ethic scholarships in particular. What symptom or what underlying cause is that trying to address, or what symptom is it treating?
I think that in the same way certain people believe romantic happiness will only happen when you locate your soulmate, I think a lot of people today believe that vocational happiness will only occur when you find your dream job. I think that's nonsense. I also think it's self-defeating, because it just, you know, if you identify the existence of the proximate cause of joy and then build giant barriers between you and it, you've just made it very difficult to feel good. So I think a lot of people have done that, and I think work ethic suffers as a result, because it's been replaced by this search ethic, right? I'm on the search for the thing that will bring me joy, as opposed to, no, it doesn't matter what the job is. You wake up early, you stay late, you take your bite of the crap sandwich, you make yourself indispensable, you master your job, and then through pluck and insistence and goodwill and humor, you run the joint in a year and a half. I still believe that can happen. And on Dirty Jobs, I met a lot of people who proved it. So yeah, there's a bit of earnest Horatio Alger, old man next door, get off my lawn, coming from my foundation. But it's best, I think, embodied in the Sweat Pledge, which was a product.
And that's an acronym. So it's not a pledge. It's not like a blood oath, right?
No, no. It stands for skills and work ethic aren't taboo.
Right.
And it was the product of a six-pack of Lagunitas and careful reflection on my part on two things: the Boy Scout law.
Then you are an Eagle Scout.
Yeah, and the 12-step recovery process from Alcoholics Anonymous. and I'm not a member of AA, but I love the idea that there's a 12-step process that might be applied to ideas of personal responsibility and personal accountability and work ethic.
And you guys have, at this point, you've given out something like $4 million. And what does that money go to, and where do you get it from?
The money comes primarily from me auctioning off the crap in my garage.
And CRAP is also an acronym.
It's important to always have acronyms, Nick. CRAP stands for Collectables, Rare, and Precious.
Right.
So the idea was my garage is just full of stuff, filthy mementos from my misspent career. And I take these mementos and I autograph them, and I try and tell an amusing story. And in the same way Jerry Lewis would hope to guilt you to giving money during a telethon by some sort of performance, I aim to raise money by entertaining you with the tale.
What is the most disgusting item that you've auctioned off?
Well, depending on who you ask, I just got 16 grand for an autographed Donald Trump bathrobe.
I was going to bring that up, but so there's that. But then talk about the semen.
Okay. I collected semen. I've collected semen for many creatures.
So somebody's got to do it,
It has
right?
to be done. And from a prize racehorse at a place called Babcock Ranch in Texas. And I collected it with the help of an artificial vagina and a baby bottle. And
you know, when I hear the story, usually there's a guy playing a whorehouse piano, but
do we have one of those? And do you guys play the piano? Yeah, you know, the horse is up on a pommel horse, literally, you know, looking at what I can only imagine is some video of Black Beauty or something. And
the secret of Roan Inish.
Misty of Chincoteague. I got a bicycle helmet on, all right? I look like a giant Pez dispenser, and I'm holding what appears to be a water bottle, which is an artificial vagina, and a baby bottle dangling from the end.
You're going to deflect with your right hand and place the artificial vagina all the way onto his penis, and then just hold steady.
Got it. I believe that horse is ready. So I approach the creature, I mean, it's in flagrante delicto, right? And I guide him into the artificial vagina and hang on as he expresses himself as only a 1-ton animal can do in the heat of the moment. And his semen fills the baby bottle. And in the baby bottle is a plastic container that houses it, and they use that usually to fill many pipettes, which are subsequently injected into the mares, the brood mares. They let me keep this particular bottle, and I had it for many years in my apartment. It sat on the edge of the mantle, and in the afternoon, Nick, the sun would come through, and it would hit it, usually between 4 and 4:30 in a way that would...
The golden hour.
It was so beautiful, the way it was like a prism, right? It was a semen-inspired prism, and these little rainbows, these semen rainbows, it would fill my living room. It was horrible. One year we had it on the Christmas tree just because. Anyway, I auctioned that off for many thousands of dollars.
Do you think that, I mean, to be serious for a minute, do you think that we've lost the wonder when we encounter artificial vaginas? Where's the, we just get mad when they don't work?
Yeah, I mean, it is very, very frustrating to come home after a long day knowing that the artificial vagina you've been thinking of all day is waiting for you, and then to suddenly find it's not. That level of disappointment.
So the robe from Donald Trump, you got $16,500 for.
There's no accounting for taste.
Yeah.
What happened was I announced the end of Somebody's Got to Do It on CNN, and I blamed Bernie, Hillary, and Donald for sucking up all the bandwidth, which is actually kind of true. And then in a PS to that post, I said, listen, if you guys feel guilty for running me off the news network, as surely you must, why don't you cough up something that I can auction off from my foundation? And I said, Bernie, send me one of those crappy blazers, the rumpled things you wear.
Hillary, she could just cough into a napkin.
God knows what we could. Actually, I invited her to send a pantsuit. I even said I'd model it, but she did. And to Donald, I said, send me one of your robes. Because a couple weeks earlier, I auctioned off a ratty old robe I had stolen from an overpriced spa in Northern California and got like $7 or $8 grand for it.
And this is why you were naked when you went out to shoot down?
I was robeless. That's right. I simply didn't have time to dress for my malfeasance. But of the three, Donald's people got back immediately. And they said, what do you want again? And I said, send me a robe from the Trump Tower. And they said, no problem. And I said, and get him to sign it. And they said, we'll run it by him. 2 days later, it showed up, signed.
There it is. No, there it is.
That's his signature.
That is his signature. And he did this on the campaign trail.
Say what you will about the guy. He understands the importance of a story, and he wasn't going to get in his own way. So he sent me the robe. I put the robe on. I probably lost 1 million friends because there I am wearing Donald's robe. But I probably gained 1 million too. And the bidding went up to 16 grand very quickly. We sent it out. We used that money for work ethic scholarships. Boom, Bob's your uncle.
You're not going to endorse anybody for president, but how do you see the politics of the moment? This is, the craziest election. Do you worry about the direction of the country beyond these questions about work ethic and the mismatch between jobs, available jobs, and training for jobs? Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are both very protectionist. They talk a lot about how trade deals are bad. How does that play into your worldview about trade or jobs that are here and whatnot?
I mean, I have a personal opinion on it, but the honest and I think better answer is, how do you want to set the table? Are we going to set the table in a way that fundamentally advantages the American consumer, or are we going to set it in a way that fundamentally advantages the American worker? And it's not a rhetorical question. It's already been asked, and we've already answered it. We've set the table in a way that benefits the consumer. And I think we've done it because they're more consumers than workers. All workers are consumers, right?
Sure.
Not all consumers are workers. So we're in the global economy, and you must be this tall to get on the ride, and there's no negotiating. We're in it right now. So, that's the bargain we've made. And we're right now realizing that maybe that wasn't the table we wanted to set after all. But I don't know how you put the poop back in the goose.
Yeah.
We either want to buy our Fords for as little money as possible.
And again, another product placement, right?
I'm done with Ford.
Yeah,
I mean, they're done with me. But it might come back around, so I'm not going to say anything too nasty. No, look, I've driven Fords all my life, and I was proud to speak on their behalf for a few years. But, when Donald says he's going to charge 35% more for a Ford that's made in Mexico, the crowd goes wild. And I get it. It sounds pretty good. Let's level stuff out. Why not?
But that does mean that we're going to be paying 35% more, either because it's tax coming in from Mexico or it costs much more to make here.
The brain tends to solve the problem it looks at. And when we're just looking at how to better manufacturing for workers, obviously, raise those tariffs, get those factories back here, problem solved. But there's always an unintended consequence. Right. It's the same kind of thinking that says, look, we all want to see people make a living wage. We all want to see people make ends meet. So let's just raise that minimum wage. Boom, problem solved. Nobody wants to see people thrown out of their apartment. Nobody wants to see hardworking people displaced. So let's control the rent.
You're in your 50s. You remember, both because of your personal story, but just because of the time you lived in, you remember periods where unemployment was double digit,
sure.
Where inflation was out of control, where the economy looked pretty bleak. Do you think millennials are facing anything like you might have faced in your teen years, or what the world looked like, or when you were their age? And what, do they have a future, and is it better than the one you grew up in, or what has to happen to kind of make things better?
Yeah, that's a great macro question. My answer is micro.
Yeah.
My foundation's called Mike Rowe Works because I'm not smart enough to speak that holistically. But I take great comfort in finding an individual who is willing to look at the landscape, however bleak, and see opportunity.
Right.
And I just think that that's always been for sale in good times and bad. And the first time, well, not the first time, but the first time as an adult that I was really confronted by that was in late 2008 on Dirty Jobs, when the headlines all across the country were screaming double-digit unemployment. And every major news story and every major newscast started with the number of people out of work. And everywhere I went on the show, Nick, every state, all I saw were help wanted signs. And so there was this other narrative going on in the country that had to do with the inability to find people who were willing to learn a skill that was actually in demand. And I was fascinated by how little that got reported. So in 2008, the skills gap was officially 2.3 million jobs. Today it's 5.8 million.
That means that these are jobs that are available for, that nobody is applying for, or nobody is qualified for.
Or nobody's getting hired for, right? It gets political, and I never mean it to, but it's impossible to not wind up in a political conversation when one side is saying, look at all these people who aren't working, and the other side is saying, look at all these jobs we can't fill. A reasonable person has to say, why? What's the problem? Is it really a lack of skill? Could it be a lack of will? Is it a geography problem? Is it really a training problem? Is it a money problem? Is it an education problem? And it just, the left will tell you that the reason these jobs are unfilled is because these greedy, rapacious capitalists simply aren't paying enough. And the right will tell you the reason these jobs aren't filled is because these lazy, good-for-nothing layabouts just don't have the work ethic required or the ambition. Or perhaps we're not going to let them starve. We're going to take care of them. You know, they're making $40,000-$45,000 a year not working right now in total benefits. So now you're in a polemic, right? And now we're talking about the human condition instead of an opportunity. So it gets pretty wonky pretty quick.
And that's what your foundation exists to kind of match up people who want jobs to figure out how to get there, get to the place to get both literally and figuratively where the jobs are.
Honestly, you're giving me too much credit. My foundation exists because I'm desperate to answer that question, and I can't. The best way I can is to say one person at a time. If I raise this money and I put it over here, and I create a sweat pledge, and I create a situation where you have to make a case for yourself, and then you make that case persuasively, then I get to do something that most foundations don't do and most scholarships don't do. Most scholarships reward academia, athleticism, talent, and of course need, right? We're affirmatively trying to reward work ethic by simply identifying a person who any company would love to hire. I'm trying to be, on a micro level, the HR department the country secretly wishes it had. So if I can in some way qualify these people, in the same way a pre-apprenticeship program might qualify a tradesman, if we can in some way qualify work ethic and character and a willingness to do the hard thing, wow. People love to support that effort, and companies love to hire that person.
In most states, in order to become a barber, you've got to go through, hundreds, if not thousands of hours of training, which costs money and takes time and, rigmarole. You go up the line, to drive a forklift, to drive a big rig, to work on an oil rig. What's your general sense? Is occupational licensing, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it get abused? Is it being used to keep people out, to restrict the labor supply so the guys who are on the inside get more money? Or is it working the way that it should be?
Yes, no. It's a good thing when there's something wrong with your brain and you need a guy to fix it, or a woman to fix your brain. I want the person working on my brain to have certificates on the wall that prove their commitment to brain work. The person working on my hair, it would be awesome if they didn't destroy it, but I don't really need the comfort, So, there was a great movie, a guy named Sean Malone did it. It's called Locked Out, where he talked about licensure in Georgia, I think, or maybe Alabama, and they were looking at hair braiding. So, they were profiling a series of black women who braided hair and were good at it and wanted to open their own businesses. And the cost, after you get all the hours and all of the stuff, was close to $20,000. So when that kind of licensure becomes a barrier to entrepreneurship, it's the opposite of good. When it exists to keep a lunatic from confusing your right and left hemisphere during brain surgery, well, it's good.
How do we change our attitude towards the trades and get rid of a lot of this 20th century baggage that just seems to be getting in the way now?
We talk, and we yell, and we scream, and we bang our shoe. And look, technology's evolving so quickly. Forget Uber. What about driverless cars? What's going to happen in the trucking industry when it's safer to have a truck with no driver? What's going to happen when you can license out your own car without a driver? Your car could be working for you right now, and it probably will be in 5-10 years.
I parked it with a valet, so I'm pretty sure he's
never see it
dealing
again.
drugs or something. Yeah, I hope he is.
So I don't know. I love the way that the technology, though, is going to force us to answer that question. I think Huxley said...
And we shouldn't stop the technology simply because it's forcing questions.
Well, that's a heck of a statement. I'm not going to disagree with you, but Huxley said the greatest enemy of freedom is total anarchy, but the second greatest enemy is total efficiency. And somewhere in there is this conversation between effectiveness versus efficiency, and part of what you're talking about, I think, these holdovers from the early 20th century. We just have to decide again how we're going to set the table, and for me, look, I'm very confusing to people who hire me sometimes because they've looked at dirty jobs and they've seen an anthem to blue-collar work. What they didn't see was that it was every bit as much an anthem to entrepreneurship and opportunity in small business. And the idea that those two things can exist as two sides of the same coin is confusing today, in the same way that, you know, there's Trump and there's Clinton.
Right.
There's blue collar and there's white collar. There's There's innovation and imitation.
I've heard people say, and I can see where they're coming from, that you romanticize physical labor or blue-collar work, and this is kind of like the way that settlers, at the moment that the Indians were fully vanquished, then they started paying tribute to them, and that it's kind of a romanticization. So what you're saying is, no, it actually isn't, because these guys are entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs do, I mean, there's a reason they call it sweat equity, right, in the beginning of a...
Of the 300 people we featured on the show, 50 were multimillionaires. Nobody knew it. A, because we didn't talk about it, and B, because they were covered in somebody else's shit. They just didn't know it. And our brains don't allow us to look at a person who looks like that and immediately equate it with success. That's a problem. That's a problem. But it's also another example of that dissonance, that cognitive dissonance. And so I just think it's a false choice. I think we're full of false choices right now, full of bad choices. Honestly, I think the election's a good example. But the way we process things and the way we force the conversation leaves us with, you know, protectionist or not protectionist, you know, blue collar or white collar. Well, what about the muddy boots architect? What about what Ayn Rand wrote about? What about the person whose collar is blue, but whose brain is that of a brilliant architect? I mean, what, you know, those are the people who are going to succeed, I believe, moving forward. And if they have a freelance mentality, then I think they're going to succeed doubly.
Well, talk about that, because you talked earlier, you said about making yourself indispensable. You show up at a job site, you know, and it can be in an office building or it can be, you know, in a garbage pit. You don't know what you're doing, and in 18 months you're running the joint. What is the secret to that?
One of the early great lessons I learned from my dad and my grandfather was you have to be willing to do the uncomfortable thing. So it's just really, it's just a muscle. If you're at a dinner party and it's over and it's time to clean up, do it. Get up and start doing the dishes. Always volunteer for the scut work. It actually is possible. Anybody can do that. The big lesson, actually, I think came from the Boy Scouts, where my scoutmaster pulled me aside at some point and said, "You want the secret to success?" I said, "Yeah, I'll take it." He said, "It's not enough to simply be willing to do the hard work. You have to find a way to love it. You have to find a way to like it, and to quietly congratulate yourself, and to take like real, not just pride, because I'm not sure what that word means anymore, but there's a nobility in it, you know, and the people who think that way and act that way, not as a pretense or a contrivance, but because that's just who they've become. I don't know anybody like that who isn't successful.
This is making me think that somewhere along the line you read Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus and applied it to work.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's making little rocks out of big rocks is soul deadening, and nothing in my worldview is in defense of drudgery. And for a long time, you know, people used to ask me on dirty jobs. One of the things that was so surprising about that show is we tuned in expecting to see drudgery, because that, of course, is what we associate with so much of that content. What we showed them on the show was something else. Usually humor. There's great good humor in the workforce, you know, and in these particular kinds of jobs, it's keen. Sometimes it's gallows oriented, but it's there. And so when you tune in expecting to see drudgery and you see humor, that was powerful. So some congressman a couple years ago actually introduced the Good Jobs Bill. The hell is that? What the hell is that? The Good Jobs Bill. Now, there's no Bad Jobs Bill, but by implication, if we're going to sit down to talk about the good jobs, we've just tacitly acknowledged the huge category of bad jobs. When we sit down to talk about the importance of higher education, we've just tacitly confessed to the existence of lower education. Now, we don't call it that because that would be gross. We call it alternative education. So the language is important. The way we set the table matters, and we start pushing kids toward an alternative. It's pretty clear that that is going to lead to a some kind of non-good job.
Right.
And so suddenly we have all these vocational consolation prizes, and you don't want your kids to have a vocational consolation prize. You want them to live a life that's the result of a higher education.
Talk a little bit about what you're trying to do with The Way I Heard It. And one of the recent, I think one of your very recent stories, you write up stories about people, has to do with a woman named Madam C.J. Walker.
Sure.
Which I think ties into a lot of the themes we've been talking about. Who is she, and why did you feel a need to write a story the way that you know, I mean, the whole idea is that you're writing stories the way you heard it, and you're telling that.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about her, and then we'll talk about your mother's letter.
So Madam C.J. Walker was the first female American millionaire, and she was the daughter of slaves. And very few people know this. She made her fortune because her hair started falling out when she was 32. And she was in a panic about it. And she had married a no-good bum, and her first husband had died very young. She was widowed. She had a little girl. She was living in Vicksburg, and you just couldn't have had a grimmer deal. She moved to St. Louis, and she developed a pomade that stopped her hair from falling out. And she started making it in her sink. And she started selling it door to door.
And this is 1900, 1905, something like that.
1905, yeah, early on. So she basically creates, way before Estee Lauder or Mary Kay, a kind of direct marketing door-to-door organization. She opens hair colleges around the country. She makes a fortune. She creates 40,000 jobs. Her real name was Sarah Breedlove. And the way I tell the story, or I tried to, the same way I do it with all these podcasts, which, by the way, is a straight-up homage to Paul Harvey. And I'm trying to channel the rest of the story. Because how many times listening to Paul Harvey did you wind up in your car, you got to where you were going, but you couldn't get out of the car until you hear the mystery. So I don't tell the viewer Sarah Breedlove is C.J. Walker. I don't tell the viewer the events are unfolding in 1905. I let people assume it's 05, 2005. And so in the end, hopefully, you know, you have this surprise reveal where we learn that a woman overcame some amazing obstacles. We learn that she was the daughter of slaves. We learn that we don't know who she is. You're one of the only people I know who's heard of C.J. Walker before. But what's going on in the 21st century where we're having this giant conversation about equality in the workplace and equal pay, and you know, we have a woman running for president, or perhaps she is by the time this airs, or perhaps she was, at least she got in the game anyway. But why don't we know who C.J. Walker was? The first female American millionaire. So to me, you know, The Way I Heard It is another opportunity for me to say, here's somebody you should know, but it's a much, much, much shorter format. I write the stories myself, I record them in the podcast world, but then to your point, I sit at my kitchen table and I read them. I read them without pretense or apology. And dude, I can't tell you, I mean, the podcast itself is, I mean, it's downloaded a few 100,000 times a week, which is nice. But the Facebook thing, sitting at my kitchen table, reading a story on Facebook, it's millions of views. If I could get, where are you people when I do a TV show? If I could get the same people watching a TV show that watch me read a story at my kitchen table, game over.
Well, when that drone footage comes out, I think you're going to go through the roof.
You
might get back on the cable nets. Talk about the letter from your mother, because this has got to be your biggest hit.
I've never seen anything like it. And I've talked to people at Facebook who said they've never seen anything like it. My mother, both my parents, by the way, are just pieces of work, and I love them, and I don't see them enough. And so a couple weeks ago, she left me a couple messages over the weekend, and I was out, and I didn't call her back. So in a beautifully thinly veiled, passive-aggressive attempt to shame me, she wrote me an email saying, look, if you'd prefer to talk publicly, you can post what I'm about to share with you on your Facebook page, and maybe I'll do the same on mine. I was simply calling you to tell you that I lost my big blue purse at Walmart, and the ensuing events I found somewhat humorous. So she proceeded to tell me this story in the form of a letter that started, Dear Mike. I read the letter. I nearly peed my pants. It was one of the funniest things I'd read, and I immediately set up the phone, I hit record, and I read it again. And then I posted on Facebook, and I went to work. In 36 hours, I came back, and 20 million people had watched this thing. And then the next day, 45 million people had watched it. And I just looked at it again before we sat down. 110 million people have been reached. A third of the country watched me sit at my kitchen table reading an email, a passive-aggressive email from my mother. So something's happening in the world. And again, it's moms, it's sons, it's big blue purses, it's Walmart, it's new technology, it's kitchen tables, and it's for sale.
And if nothing else, I mean, you're hosting or you're making space for a conversation that we want to have, obviously, if people are watching that.
Look, I hope. I mean, back to your first question, which I thought was kind of brilliant. You know, the degree, you know, how are we connecting? And how are we disconnected? And where are we going socially? There's so much noise everywhere. I just think people are really, really craving these honest, the word's overused, but authentic moments. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, everybody's lost their wallet or their purse. Everybody's mother has given them crap for not calling back. Everybody's gotten, you know, a shaming email. But not everybody has puked it up for the world to see. And so that just happened. And now my mother has a book deal. And an agent. Oi.
Yeah. We have been talking with Mike Rowe of the Mike Rowe Works Foundation. Check him out at Facebook. Check him out all over the place, from Dirty Jobs to Somebody's Got to Do It, and to his fantastic podcast, The Way I Heard It. Mike, thanks so much for talking to Reason.
Next time you wear the hat, I wear the coat.
Okay. I'll wear the robe if you
there
got
you
the
go.
extra robe.
I'll make some calls.
For Reason TV, I'm Nick Gillespie.